Welcome to our deep dive into Christopher Lloyd's The Well-Tempered Garden. This book is full of unconventional wisdom. Even if you're a seasoned gardener or just figuring out where to put your first tomato plant, there's something in here for you.
You see, Christopher Lloyd wasn't your average by-the-book gardener. He really understood that plants, like people, have individual needs and preferences. And once you grasp those, that's when your garden truly thrives.
It's almost like he viewed plants as having personalities, right? And speaking of personality, Lloyd doesn't shy away from strong opinions. He had some fascinating takes on planting itself, especially the importance of timing.
It's all about minimizing stress for the plant. He noticed that planting trees, shrubs, even perennials at the right time leads to far fewer losses. Imagine trying to move right before a heat wave. That's basically what we're doing to plants if we're not careful.
That makes so much sense. Okay, so I've always been told to space out my shrubs according to those little diagrams they put on plant tags. Lloyd seemed to disagree with that approach.
He absolutely did. He called out those rigid spacing rules, arguing that cramming them in a little closer together, especially in the early years, provides instant visual impact and protection from the elements. It's like they're huddling together for warmth. Of course, you'll need to make adjustments as they grow, but it challenges those preconceived notions about spacing, doesn't it?
It totally does.
Yeah.
And speaking of challenging norms, he even had his own way of handling evergreens. Tell me about his take on the best time to plant these garden staples.
He was very specific about this, suggesting early autumn or spring as ideal times to plant evergreens. However, he warned against planting in late autumn, especially for young, broad-leaved varieties. Think of it this way. Many of these evergreens originated in warmer climates. Planting them right before winter is like throwing someone in a blizzard without a coat. They need time to acclimate.
Wow, that's a great analogy. I can see why he was such a proponent of observation. He also had some really down-to-earth solutions, like using grit as a root protector for those vulnerable camellias in winter.
He really emphasized understanding the individual plant. Grit, being coarse and well-draining, acts as insulation, preventing those delicate roots from experiencing those temperature swings that can lead to frost damage. Simple, yet effective.
Speaking of simple, his approach to summering his potted shrubs was genius. Using the garden as a holding area after a good soaking. Makes so much sense.
He's demonstrating that flexibility is key. Instead of confining those shrubs to pots all summer long, he's giving them a chance to stretch their roots and soak up the sun before going back into their winter quarters. It's about working with the natural rhythms of the plant.
He definitely marched to the beat of his own gardening drum. Now let's dig into soil fertility and mulching. He was a big fan of farmyard manure, wasn't he?
Absolutely. He understood that manure was liquid gold, packed full of nutrients, but he also knew those nutrients could easily wash away. He was a big proponent of mixing it with straw.
Why was that? What did the straw do?
Well, imagine straw as a sponge. It absorbs the liquid component of the manure, which actually holds the most nutrients, preventing them from leaching out and ensuring those nutrients slowly release into the soil, feeding your plants over time.
Clever, right. He really thought of everything. Now, he wasn't just a fan of any mulching material, was he?
That's right. He had some caveats about using certain materials like straw as mulch. While beneficial for moisture retention and weed suppression, Lloyd observed that they could pull nitrogen from the soil as they decompose.
That's interesting. What was his solution for that?
He recommended supplementing nitrogen levels in the soil when using such mulches. He understood it was all about maintaining that delicate balance of nutrients to ensure healthy plant growth.
Makes you realize how much thought he put into every aspect of the garden. So now let's talk about pruning, specifically, how he demystified clematis pruning with his three main rules. It's something a lot of gardeners find daunting.
It all comes down to timing and understanding the type of clematis you're working with. Lloyd's system categorized them based on their flowering habits and provided clear guidelines for when and how to prune for maximum blooms.
He also seemed to prefer a more natural approach to staking, didn't he?
Absolutely. He steered clear of those rigid metal or plastic supports and instead opted for natural materials like pruned shrub twigs for plants like asters and alströmerias. It blends seamlessly into the garden while offering gentle support, letting the natural beauty of the plant shine through.
It's like he wanted his garden to feel like a collaboration with nature, not a domination of it. And even something like deadheading, he challenged the norm, didn't he?
He did. Lloyd pointed out that while many gardeners deadhead spent blooms, some plants have these amazing seed heads that offer a different kind of beauty well into the dormant season. He specifically mentions sedums and dictamnos for their decorative seed heads, encouraging gardeners to appreciate the entire life cycle of the plant.
It makes you think about what kind of garden experience you want to create, right? Do you want just a burst of color, or are you looking for that ever-evolving year-round tapestry? Speaking of tapestry, he really had a way with propagation.
He really did. He offered detailed instructions for various shrubs, stressing the importance of using the right techniques for each one. For instance, with Daphnes, Ericas, and even camellias, he provided step-by-step guidance for successful cuttings.
And it doesn't stop there. He even covered root cuttings and grafting, which can sound really intimidating to a novice gardener.
He made those techniques feel accessible and exciting. He talked about using hawthorn seedlings as rootstocks for grafting trees like medlars, suggesting a whole world of possibilities for experimenting with different compatible species. It speaks to his adventurous spirit.
Totally. He even challenged the common belief that direct sowing seeds is the easiest method, advocating instead for starting indoors.
He had his reasons. He found that starting seeds indoors gave him greater control over those crucial early stages of growth, leading to stronger seedlings. He highlighted the challenges of direct sowing, battling unpredictable weather, pesky weeds competing for resources, and those birds that just love a seed buffet. Starting indoors was his way of giving seedlings a fighting chance.
It makes sense when you think about how vulnerable those tiny seedlings are. So what were some of his tips for ensuring those indoor seedlings thrived?
He was all about maximizing their growth potential. He recommended individual pots or generously spacing seedlings in trays to avoid overcrowding. It's about giving those root systems plenty of room to develop without having to compete for resources. This leads to stronger plants when it's time to transplant them outdoors.
You can tell he really enjoyed the entire process. He even recommended trying late-blooming annuals like China asters to extend your garden's interest well into the fall.
He loved those pops of color. Imagine a garden still vibrant with those cheerful blooms as the first frost approaches. It's a testament to his philosophy of creating a garden that offers year-round interest.
And he wasn't afraid of bold combinations either. Tell me about his approach to bedding plants.
He preferred a more relaxed, informal style, encouraging gardeners to experiment with bold colors and textures to create visually striking displays. He moved away from those rigid, formal bedding schemes, advocating instead for a more natural and free-flowing aesthetic.
Speaking of embracing the unconventional, Lloyd had a real soft spot for some unusual plants. Who else recommends growing gourds?
That's pure Lloyd. He saw the beauty in the unexpected, and gourds, with their constantly changing shapes and vibrant colors throughout the growing season, definitely fit that bill. He was captivated by their unique forms and textures.
It speaks to his playful side, right? He wasn't just creating a garden, he was curating an experience. And I can't forget his love of those beautiful colchicums or autumn crocuses.
He was fascinated by their ability to bring a touch of unexpected color to the autumn garden, debunking the myth that they need to be deeply planted. He actually found they thrived in sunny locations, even in grass. He just had a knack for understanding what made each plant tick. He really did. And speaking of pushing boundaries, Lloyd wasn't just interested in the tried and true. He even suggested incorporating hardy orchids into the garden.
Now that sounds like a challenge even for seasoned gardeners. What was his thinking there?
He wanted to dispel the myth that orchids are these fussy, high-maintenance plants. He believed that by carefully selecting the right species for your climate and providing the right growing conditions, anyone could enjoy their unique beauty in a garden setting. It's about challenging those preconceived notions and experimenting.
He was all about expanding our gardening horizons. Now, I have to ask about his fascination with yellow gardens. I wouldn't have pegged him for a one-color theme kind of guy.
This is where his understanding of texture and form comes into play. He wasn't just talking about a sea of yellow flowers. He envisioned a garden where the contrasting textures of plants like brooms, with their fine, airy foliage, played off the bold structural forms of innulas. It's about creating a visual symphony in a single color, demonstrating that even within a limited palette, you can achieve incredible depth and interest.
That makes so much sense. He was a true artist at heart. Now let's talk about his unique approach to garden design and maintenance, particularly this idea of tapestry gardening. It sounds almost counterintuitive to how most people approach their gardens.
It really does challenge the conventional wisdom of neatly separating plants and controlling their growth. Lloyd's vision was all about embracing the dynamic interplay between plants. He believed in letting them intermingle and even compete a bit for resources and space, creating a more naturalistic and visually captivating landscape.
So it's less about imposing order and more about guiding the natural flow of the garden.
Exactly. Think of it as a living tapestry where different colors, textures, and forms weave in and out of each other, creating a beautiful, ever-changing composition. He loved those moments of serendipity when a self-sown seedling would pop up in an unexpected spot, adding a new dimension to a planting combination.
It's almost like the garden takes on a life of its own, right? But with a guiding hand to ensure things don't get too out of control. He wasn't afraid to address those aggressive growers, though. I remember him mentioning a clematis overwhelming a flowering quince.
That's a perfect example of why observation is so crucial. Lloyd wasn't advocating for a complete free-for-all in the garden. He understood that some plants, like that ambitious clematis, need a bit of reining in to maintain balance and harmony. He wanted us to work with those growth habits, not against them.
So it's about finding that balance between allowing for natural growth and making those strategic interventions when necessary.
Precisely. It's a dance between gardener and nature, recognizing that sometimes you need to step in and make adjustments to keep things thriving.
He wasn't afraid to challenge those deeply ingrained gardening myths either, was he? Like those watering misconceptions that persist even today.
He really took those on. He refuted the idea that frequent, shallow watering was beneficial, emphasizing that a single deep soaking was far more effective in encouraging those roots to grow deep and strong, making plants more resilient to drought conditions. It's about working smarter, not harder, in the garden.
And what about that persistent myth that clematis need lime? Didn't he debunk that one too?
He certainly did. He argued that moisture and nutrient levels were far more critical for clematis health and vigor than adding lime to the soil. He was always challenging those long-held beliefs, urging gardeners to question the why behind their practices.
It's like he was pushing us to be more than just gardeners. He wanted us to be plant detectives, figuring out those clues and understanding the science behind those flourishing ecosystems. And speaking of flourishing, he had some incredible tips for seasonal highlights and plant recommendations. His enthusiasm for autumn color was infectious.
It really was. He had a real knack for making you appreciate the beauty of every season. He described trees like the Liriodendron tulipifera, with its unique tulip-shaped leaves transforming into vibrant yellows and oranges in autumn, and you could practically feel the crisp air and see those leaves practically glowing.
His descriptions were so vivid, weren't they? He had a way of transporting you right into his garden. And it wasn't just about those showy blooms. He understood the importance of winter interest, too.
He emphasized incorporating elements that provided visual appeal even in the depths of winter. He described the elegant silhouettes of conifers like the golden cypress against a snowy backdrop, or the way evergreens with their colorful foliage brightened up those dreary winter days. It's about creating a garden that delights the senses year-round.
He was a true master of observation, noticing those subtle details that most people might overlook. And he didn't just stop at describing them, he wanted you to experience them too. Remember his description of the way the wind rustled through the massive leaves of a Genera manicata?
It's like he painted a picture with words. He compared that sound to a giant shaving, instantly transporting you to his garden and making you feel the breeze and hear those leaves rustling.
He had such a way with words. It wasn't just about conveying information, it was about sharing an experience. And he wasn't afraid to inject his own personality into his writing either, was he? He had a wonderful sense of humor.
He really did. He could be quite witty. Like when he referred to those ubiquitous red salvia, white alyssum, and blue lobelia combinations as our most popular floral interpretation of the patriotic combination.
He wasn't afraid to poke a little fun at gardening conventions, reminding us not to take ourselves too seriously. But at the same time, he had this deep respect for plants and their ability to bring beauty and joy into our lives.
Absolutely. He wanted us to appreciate the subtle beauty of those often overlooked plants like teasels, and he championed those late bloomers like China asters, reminding us that the gardening year doesn't have to end with the first frost.
He was a champion for those underdogs of the plant world, wasn't he? And he never missed an opportunity to share a good plant combination. Remember his suggestion of pairing the contrasting textures of brooms and indulas in a yellow-themed garden.
It's a classic Lloyd move. He understood the power of texture and form to elevate a garden design. He wasn't just throwing plants together, he was creating those visual relationships that make a garden sing.
He was a true artist in the garden, and he encouraged us to be artists too, to experiment with different plants and combinations and to discover those unexpected pairings that brought us joy.
And he didn't shy away from those more challenging plants either. Remember his suggestion of incorporating hardy orchids into the garden?
That's what I'm still wrapping my head around. What made him think that was a realistic goal for the average gardener?
It was that belief that knowledge is power. He understood that orchids often have a reputation for being fussy, but he believed that with the right information and a bit of dedication, anyone could grow these fascinating plants successfully.
So it's about empowering gardeners with the knowledge and confidence to step outside their comfort zones and experiment with something new.
Exactly. He wanted to break down those barriers and show people that even the most seemingly intimidating plants could be grown successfully with the right approach.
He was all about pushing boundaries and challenging those limiting beliefs about what's possible in the garden. And he didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk, sharing his own experiences, both successes and failures, to illustrate his points.
He was incredibly open about his own gardening journey, wasn't he? He didn't shy away from those moments when things didn't go according to plan. He talked about losing plants to pests, diseases, even his own gardening mishaps, reminding us that even the most experienced gardeners face setbacks.
It's that honesty that makes him so relatable. He wasn't afraid to admit his mistakes, and in doing so, he gave us permission to embrace those inevitable bumps in our own gardening journeys.
He understood that gardening is a process of constant learning and adaptation. He encouraged us to view those so-called failures as opportunities for growth, reminding us that there's always something to be learned from every experience in the garden.
He had a way of finding the positive in every situation, didn't he? Even when faced with challenges, he'd find a lesson, a silver lining, a reason to keep going. And that's such an important message for gardeners, especially those who might be feeling discouraged or overwhelmed.
He wanted us to know that we're not alone in our struggles, that even the most experienced gardeners have those moments of doubt or frustration. But he also reminded us that the rewards of gardening, the beauty, the connection to nature, the sense of accomplishment, far outweigh the challenges.
And he was always there to offer encouragement and guidance, sharing his knowledge and experience in a way that was both informative and inspiring. Remember his advice on managing those vigorous growers that can quickly take over a garden.
He had some great tips, didn't he? He understood the need to keep those plants in check, but he also advocated for working with their natural growth habits rather than fighting against them. For example, he suggested training a Budalger alternifolia as a staked standard to keep its sprawling tendencies under control while still allowing it to showcase its beautiful cascading blooms.
It's about finding those creative solutions that work with the plant, not against it. He was all about finding that balance between respecting a plant's natural tendencies and guiding its growth to suit our own gardening visions.
And he never missed an opportunity to share his knowledge about specific plants, did he? He'd offer those little tidbits of information like how to overwinter tender shrubs like Solanum crispum glasnevin and Melianthus major in colder climates that can make all the difference for gardeners looking to expand their plant palettes and experiment with new and unusual species.
He was a walking encyclopedia of plant knowledge, wasn't he? He seemed to have a story or a fascinating fact about every plant he encountered. And he wasn't afraid to tackle those common gardening problems that we all face, like replant disease in roses.
That's a frustrating one. But he provided practical advice for overcoming it, even suggesting removing and replacing the soil in the planting area to avoid those issues. He understood that sometimes those drastic measures are necessary to ensure the health and success of our plants.
He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, both literally and figuratively, when it came to solving those gardening dilemmas. And he didn't shy away from those more complex issues either, like the problem of virus diseases in roses.
He shed light on the fact that, unlike with fruits like strawberries and raspberries, there's no widespread control over the propagation of roses from virus-free stock, which unfortunately contributes to the spread of those diseases. It's those little insights that give you a whole new perspective on the challenges and complexities of maintaining healthy plant populations.
He had a way of making you think about the bigger picture, didn't he? It wasn't just about what was happening in our own backyards. It was about understanding the interconnectedness of the plant world and the challenges that gardeners face on a larger scale.
And he did it all with such passion and enthusiasm. He truly loved plants and wanted to share that love with the world.
It's that infectious enthusiasm that shines through in his writing, making you feel like you're having a conversation with a friend who just happens to be a gardening genius. Remember how he described the leaves of a Gunnera manicata moving in the wind?
He said it sounded like a giant shaving, didn't he? It's those unexpected descriptions that make his writing so memorable and so engaging. You can tell he delighted in those little details, those sensory experiences that make gardening so special.
He had a way of noticing those subtle things that most of us would miss, and he brought them to life with his words, making you feel like you were right there in the garden with him, experiencing those moments firsthand.
He was a master of observation and a gifted storyteller, and he used those skills to share his passion for gardening with the world.
He also had a knack for making even the most mundane gardening tasks sound fascinating. Remember his detailed instructions for overwintering tender shrubs. He made it sound like an adventure.
He was a master at demystifying those gardening techniques that can seem daunting to beginners, making them feel accessible and achievable. He wanted everyone to experience the joy and satisfaction of successfully nurturing plants, no matter their skill level.
He had a way of making you feel like you could accomplish anything in the garden, didn't he? He believed in us, even when we doubted ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's a powerful thing.
It really is. He empowered us to be more confident gardeners, to experiment, to take risks, and to embrace the learning process.
He understood that gardening is not about achieving perfection, but about embracing those imperfections and learning from our mistakes along the way. And that's a message that resonates with gardeners of all levels, from the seasoned pro to the enthusiastic beginner.
Absolutely. He reminded us that gardening is a journey, not a destination, and that the true joy comes from embracing the process, the ups and downs, the successes and failures, and those unexpected moments of beauty and wonder that the garden throws our way.
He also challenged our perceptions about which plants deserved a place in our gardens. He was fascinated by those often overlooked species, those underdogs of the plant world, and he encouraged us to see their potential.
He had a way of making us appreciate those plants that we might have otherwise dismissed. He'd highlight their unique qualities, their interesting backstories, or their ability to thrive in challenging conditions, and suddenly we'd see them in a whole new light.
He was a champion for those unsung heroes of the garden, wasn't he? And he didn't just advocate for those unusual plants, he also encouraged us to think differently about how we use those more familiar species. Remember his suggestion of incorporating those ubiquitous gourds into our culinary adventures.
It was a classic Lloyd move. He loved to challenge those preconceived notions about plants and their uses. He'd push us to see beyond the obvious, to experiment with different ways of using plants, and to discover those hidden gems that might surprise and delight us.
He had a way of opening our eyes to those possibilities that we might never have considered otherwise. And it wasn't just about pushing boundaries, it was also about sharing his passion for plants and encouraging us to develop our own personal connections with them.
He understood that gardening is about more than just following rules and formulas. It's about developing a relationship with the natural world, about paying attention to the subtle cues that our plants give us, and about finding joy in the process of nurturing life.
He wanted us to experience the magic of the garden, didn't he? That sense of wonder and awe that comes from witnessing the transformation of a tiny seed into a thriving plant, or from observing the intricate details of a flower or leaf.
He had a way of reminding us that even the most common plants are capable of inspiring awe and delight if we take the time to truly see them.
And he encouraged us to bring those observations into our own gardens, to experiment with different plants and combinations, and to create those personal sanctuaries that reflected our own unique tastes and preferences.
He believed that the garden should be a reflection of the gardener, a place where we could express our creativity, nurture our souls, and connect with the natural world on a deeper level.
He was all about empowering us to be the best gardeners we could be, and he did it with such grace, humor, and generosity of spirit. Now, let's dive into his insights on lawns, an often overlooked aspect of the garden.
He didn't shy away from tackling those emerald carpets, did he? He understood that for many gardeners, a lush, vibrant lawn is the cornerstone of their outdoor space. But he also challenged those conventional notions about lawn care, encouraging us to move away from those chemical-laden, high-maintenance practices that can be harmful to the environment.
He was a strong advocate for a more sustainable and eco-friendly approach, wasn't he?
Absolutely. He emphasized the importance of understanding the specific needs of your lawn and adapting your practices accordingly. He'd talk about the benefits of using organic fertilizers and soil amendments, advocating for those practices that nurtured the soil and created a healthy foundation for a thriving lawn.
He was all about working with nature, not against it. Remember his advice on mowing?
He had some interesting thoughts on that, didn't he? He stressed the importance of adjusting the mowing height based on the time of year and the specific type of grass you were growing. He believed that by understanding the growth habits of your grass, you could encourage a healthier, more resilient lawn that required less water and fewer inputs.
It's about working smarter, not harder, in the garden, right?
Exactly, and he didn't just focus on the practical aspects. He also encouraged us to think differently about the aesthetics of our lawns. He'd suggest incorporating wildflowers and native grasses into those traditional lawn spaces, creating a more diverse and ecologically beneficial landscape that supported pollinators and other beneficial insects.
He was ahead of his time in that regard, wasn't he? He recognized the importance of creating those ecologically sound landscapes that worked in harmony with nature.
He understood that our gardens, including our lawns, are part of a larger ecosystem, and he encouraged us to make choices that benefited not just our plants, but also the creatures that depend on them for survival.
His approach to lawn care was a far cry from those perfectly manicured, chemically treated expanses of green that we often see. He envisioned lawns that were not just beautiful to look at, but also teeming with life and contributing to the health of the surrounding environment.
He challenged us to rethink our relationship with our lawns, to see them not just as aesthetic elements, but as integral parts of a thriving ecosystem.
And he didn't stop at our own backyards. He was also a passionate advocate for bringing those beautiful and inspiring gardens into our urban environments.
He understood the importance of green spaces in those concrete jungles, didn't he? He envisioned cities where vibrant gardens were woven into the urban fabric, transforming those sterile landscapes into havens for both people and wildlife.
He had a vision for a greener, more vibrant urban future, didn't he? And he didn't just dream about it. He offered practical solutions for making that vision a reality. Remember his emphasis on choosing the right plants for those challenging urban conditions.
He understood the unique challenges that urban gardeners face, from limited space and sunlight to pollution and poor soil conditions. He'd suggest those tough-as-nails species that could withstand those harsh urban stresses, emphasizing those plants that were tolerant of drought, pollution, and even those occasional knocks and bumps from city life.
He wanted those urban gardens to be not just beautiful, but also resilient, able to thrive in those less than ideal conditions. And he didn't stop at ornamental plants either. He also encouraged the integration of edible plants into those urban spaces.
He loved the idea of those productive urban gardens, didn't he? He envisioned those spaces where communities could come together to grow their own food, connecting with nature and each other in the process.
He saw the potential for those gardens to transform not just our cities, but also our relationships with food and with each other. And he wasn't afraid to think outside the box when it came to those urban gardening solutions.
He was full of innovative ideas, wasn't he? He'd talk about green roofs, transforming those barren rooftops into lush oases, or those vertical gardens bringing life and beauty to those stark city walls. He even advocated for those pocket parks, those little slices of nature tucked away in those unexpected corners of the city, offering those moments of respite and tranquility amidst the hustle and bustle.
He wanted to bring the beauty and the benefits of nature into those spaces where they were often lacking, didn't he? He believed that everyone, regardless of where they lived, deserved access to those green spaces that could soothe the soul, inspire the imagination, and connect us to the natural world.
He was a true visionary in that regard, and his ideas continue to inspire those urban gardening movements that are transforming cities around the world.
Now, as we delve deeper into Lloyd's gardening philosophy, one of the key takeaways is his emphasis on observation. He believed that by paying close attention to our plants and our gardens, we could gain a deeper understanding of their needs and learn to garden in a more intuitive and responsive way.
He was a firm believer in the power of observation, wasn't he? He encouraged us to be present in our gardens, to engage all our senses, and to notice those subtle cues that our plants give us.
He wanted us to be more than just caretakers of our gardens. He wanted us to be students, constantly observing, learning, and adapting our practices based on what we saw and experienced.
He'd remind us to pay attention to those early signs of pest or disease infestation, noticing those subtle changes in foliage color, growth habit, or flowering patterns that could indicate a problem.
He understood that early detection is key to effectively addressing those issues before they become major problems.
He also encouraged us to observe the way our plants were growing, noting whether they were reaching for the sun, sprawling across the ground, or struggling to compete with their neighbors.
He understood that those growth habits could tell us a lot about a plant's needs, whether it needed more sunlight, more space, or a different location in the garden to truly thrive.
He also stressed the importance of paying attention to the weather patterns in our gardens, noting those changes in temperature, rainfall, and wind that could affect the health and growth of our plants. He wanted us to be aware of those microclimates within our own gardens, those subtle variations in growing conditions that could influence a plant's success or failure.
It's about becoming a student of your own backyard, isn't it? paying attention to those nuances that often go unnoticed but can make all the difference.
He even encouraged us to pay attention to the wildlife that visited our gardens, those birds, insects, and other creatures that interacted with our plants.
He saw those interactions as clues, didn't he?
He did. He understood that those creatures could tell us a lot about the health of our gardens and the role that our plants played in supporting the larger ecosystem.
It's about seeing our gardens as part of something much bigger than ourselves, isn't it? Recognizing those connections between our plant choices and the creatures that depend on them.
Exactly. He wanted us to be mindful of those ripple effects and to create gardens that not only brought us joy, but also contributed to the well-being of the planet.
He was a true champion for a more holistic and sustainable approach to gardening. And his emphasis on observation wasn't just about gathering information. It was about cultivating a deeper appreciation for the natural world and finding those moments of wonder and awe in our own backyards.
He wanted us to slow down, to engage all our senses, and to truly experience the garden, to notice those subtle changes, those intricate details, and those unexpected moments of beauty that often go unnoticed in our busy lives.
He reminded us that the garden is a place of constant discovery, where something new is always waiting to be revealed if we just take the time to look.
He was a master at finding those extraordinary moments in the ordinary, and he encouraged us to do the same.
Now, speaking of finding the extraordinary in the ordinary, I have to ask about his love of trees. He seemed to have a particular fondness for those giants of the plant world.
He really did. He understood that trees occupy a special place in our gardens and in our hearts. He saw them as symbols of strength, resilience, and longevity. And he believed that no garden was complete without them.
He often talked about those long-lived species, didn't he? Those trees that would outlive us all, standing as silent witnesses to the passage of time.
He loved that sense of history and permanence that trees brought to the garden. He'd talk about planting a tree for future generations, imagining those children and grandchildren enjoying its shade, its beauty, or the fruits of its labor long after we were gone.
It's a beautiful sentiment, isn't it? That sense of continuity that trees represent. But he was also practical when it came to choosing and caring for those arboreal companions.
Absolutely. He emphasized the importance of selecting the right tree for the right location, considering factors like mature size, growth rate, soil requirements, and sunlight exposure.
He wanted us to avoid those common pitfalls of planting a tree in the wrong spot, only to watch it struggle or outgrow its space, didn't he?
He did. He understood that trees are a long-term investment, and he wanted us to make informed choices that would ensure their health and longevity.
And he didn't just focus on their aesthetic value. He also emphasized those ecological benefits that trees provide.
He was a firm believer in planting trees for the planet, wasn't he?
He was. He understood those crucial roles that trees play in our ecosystem, providing oxygen, sequestering carbon, providing habitat for wildlife, and mitigating the effects of climate change.
He saw trees as essential partners in creating a healthier, more sustainable world, and he encouraged us to do our part by planting and caring for these magnificent beings.
And he didn't just talk about trees in general terms. He had his favorites, those species that held a special place in his heart, didn't he?
He did. He'd share those fascinating facts and anecdotes about each one, highlighting those unique characteristics, those captivating stories, or those unexpected uses that made each species so special.
Like the time he described the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves of a Gunnera manicata as a giant shaving.
It's those unexpected descriptions that make his writing so memorable and so engaging. He had a way of making those trees come alive with his words, transporting us to his garden and allowing us to experience their beauty and wonder firsthand.
He was a master storyteller, wasn't he?
He was, and he used those skills to share his passion for trees, to deepen our understanding of these magnificent plants, and to inspire us to incorporate them into our own gardens and our lives.
Now, as we reflect on our deep dive into Christopher Lloyd's The Well-Tempered Garden, I'm struck by the depth and breadth of his knowledge. He seemed to have an encyclopedic understanding of plants, from the tiniest alpine flower to the tallest tree.
He really did. He was a true plantsman, fascinated by every aspect of the plant world.
And yet, despite all his knowledge and experience, he never lost that sense of wonder and curiosity. He approached gardening with a childlike enthusiasm, always eager to learn something new, try something different, and share those discoveries with others.
That's what makes his writing so enduringly appealing, isn't it? It's that infectious enthusiasm that shines through in every page, inspiring us to approach our own gardens with that same sense of curiosity, creativity, and joy.
He challenged us to be more than just gardeners. He wanted us to be artists, scientists, and stewards of the natural world, all rolled into one.
He believed that gardening had the power to transform not just our landscapes, but also our lives, connecting us to nature, nurturing our souls, and fostering a deeper appreciation for the beauty and wonder of the world around us.
So, as we reach the end of our deep dive, I'm left with a renewed sense of appreciation for the garden and for the wisdom of Christopher Lloyd. His book is a treasure trove of knowledge, inspiration, and practical advice, and it's one that I'll be returning to again and again for years to come.
It's a timeless classic for a reason, and I think Lloyd would be delighted to know that his words continue to inspire generations of gardeners to create those well-tempered gardens of their own.
So, if there's one thing you take away from this deep dive, let it be this. Embrace Lloyd's spirit of adventure, experiment in your garden, and never stop observing the wonders that unfold around you. Who knows what hidden gems and unexpected delights you might discover?